Chapter 4. The Presence of God. Awareness of the presence of God is understood as the mystical perception that God pervades one's own being and all creation. It is a sense of divine immediacy or closeness, and an intuitive understanding that, to the divine, everything is an open book. But in fact, although there may be differences of intensity and duration, the eternal now, the presence of God, epiphany, and all such expressions refer to the same kind of experience. The soul or spirit, one's real inner being, is simply making its presence felt. Many mystics have spoken of the immanent, caring, intimate presence of the divine. As Plotinus says, the divine is always within reach. The good is gentle and friendly and tender, and present with us when we but will. The immanent omnipresence of a divine, transcendent being within all created things is also an integral aspect of the philosophy of the unknown Syrian monk and Christian Neoplatonist, flourished circa 500 CE, whose works were written as if composed some centuries earlier by Dionysius the Areopagite, a convert of St. Paul who receives a passing mention in the Acts of the Apostles. Everything and any part of anything participates in the One, and on the existence of the One, everything depends for its existence. Pseudo-Dionysius, Divine Names. Many other mystics have elaborated the same theme. Not only is the divine present in all things, he is the essence of the soul. As Abbé Henri de Tourville, 1842-1903, says, the soul is saturated with his presence. Our true light and power lie in the hidden source of interior grace, in which God springs up ceaselessly within our souls. The soul is saturated with God's own life, His presence, His activity, His inspiration, His encouragement, and the radiance of His presence. Abbé Henri de Tourville, Letters of Direction, 16. He is present in all creatures and in all places. It is only human imperfection that sees him as present more in one place than another. Johann Tauler, circa 1300 to 1361, German Dominican preacher and disciple of Meister Eckhart, writes, God is alike near in all creatures. Whether a man should walk out in the fields and say his prayers and feel God's presence, or whether he be in the church and feel God's presence, does he perceive him any the better because he is in a place of rest? If he does, it comes from his own infirmity. The difference is not on God's side, for God is in all things and places alike, and is ever alike ready to give himself to us, in so far as we are able to receive him. And he knows God aright, who sees him in all things. Johann Tauler, Sermons 2. François de Sales, 1567-1622, Bishop of Geneva and influential spiritual director, says that inward recollection is enhanced by anything that reminds us of the divine. Inward recollection of soul is caused not only by an awareness of God's sacramental presence deep down in the heart, but by anything at all that makes us aware of His presence. Sometimes, all the powers of our souls are concentrated and withdrawn as a result of the deep reverence, the undisturbing awe that takes hold of us as we reflect on the majesty of the King in whose presence we are, and who is looking at us. The mere presence of God, the mere impression we have that He is looking at us from outside, so to speak, from heaven or anywhere else, even though, for the time being, we have forgotten his presence within us, causes our faculties and powers to concentrate, to recollect themselves, out of reverence for his divine majesty. Love makes us fear him, but it is love born of honor, of respect. I knew a soul, as a matter of fact, to whom you had only to say something, in confession or in private conversation, which reminded her of God's presence a little more vividly than usual, and she would go into such a deep state of recollection that she was hard put to emerge from it, to speak and answer you. So much so that she gave the impression of being lifeless, all her senses deadened, until, sooner or later, the bridegroom allowed her to recover. François de Sales, Love of God. The inner condition of such a soul that is so completely withdrawn from the world is also described by the English mystic Walter Hilton, circa 1340 to 1396. Writing of the soul who is exalted in him, and whose gaze is fixed so closely on God that all things are beneath it, he says, "The soul is then alone, for it is entirely estranged from the society of those who love the world, although it still remains among them bodily. It has entirely renounced all worldly love of creatures, and is not concerned if it never sees or speaks to a man, or receives comfort from one, so long as it may always continue in the same spiritual state. For it is so deeply conscious of the intimate and blessed presence of God, and so delights in him, that for his love it can easily forego all love of worldly creatures, and even abandon the memory of them. I do not say that it will no longer love or think of other creatures, but rather that it will think of them at the right times, and will regard them and love them with a free and spiritual love, not with an anxious and carnal love as heretofore." Therefore, Hilton counsels, we should desire always to be conscious, so far as we may, of the lively inspiration of grace brought about by the spiritual presence of God within our souls. We should desire to contemplate him constantly with reverence, and always to feel the sweetness of his love in the wondrous nearness of his presence. Walter Hilton, Ladder of Perfection. Sometimes it requires only a small but significant change of outlook for awareness of God to come alive. The French mystic and aristocrat, Madame Jean-Marie Bouvier de la Motte-Guillon, 1648 to 1717, describes in her autobiography the simple way in which she personally came to experience his presence. Struggling with numerous personal issues, her illness and that of her husband, a neglectful mother, a hostile mother-in-law, financial difficulties, etc., Madame Guillon sought God in prayer, but without success. Persuaded by her sick father, she put her problems in prayer to a Franciscan monk, a very religious person, who was in the area at the time. The monk advised her, "It is, madame, because you seek without what you have within. Accustom yourself to seek God in your heart, and you will find him there." These words struck her like the stroke of a dart, enabling her to realize that God was already in her heart, and demanding, as she relates, only a simple turning of my mind inward to make her perceive his presence. She continues, "I told this man that I did not know what he had done to me, that my heart was quite changed, that God was there. He had given me an experience of his presence in my soul, not by thought or any application of mind, but as a thing really possessed in the sweetest manner. I slept not that whole night, because your love, O my God, flowed in me like a delicious oil, and burned as a fire that was going to devour all that was left of self. I was suddenly so altered that I was hardly to be known either by myself or others. I no longer found those troublesome faults or reluctances. They disappeared, being consumed like chaff in a great fire. Madame Guyon, Autobiography. Many years later, imprisoned on grounds of heresy for teaching a method of experiencing God in inner silence, she nonetheless enjoys a state of continual bliss in the divine presence. I passed my time in great peace, content to spend the rest of my life there, if such were the will of God. I sang songs of joy, which the maid who served me learned by heart, as fast as I made them up. Together we sang your praises, O my God. The stones of my prison looked in my eyes like rubies. I esteemed them more than all the gaudy brilliances of a vain world. My heart was full of that joy which you give to them who love you in the midst of their greatest crosses. Madame Guyon, Autobiography. Experience of the divine is not something commanded by Scripture or determined by religious doctrine. It is not something that can be switched on and off at will. Nonetheless, while God may be in all things, a sense of his presence can be disturbed by beliefs and preconceptions concerning his nature. The Spanish Carmelite mystic, Saint Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 1582, mentions a confusion that arose in her mind from a conflict between her experience of the divine presence and her preconceived beliefs. She also describes how this conflict was resolved. There was one thing of which at first I was ignorant. I did not know that God was in all things, and though he seemed to me to be so very present, I thought this omnipresence to be impossible. Yet I could not cease believing that he was there, since it seemed very clear that I was conscious of his very presence. Unlearned persons told me that he was present only by grace, but I could not believe this, because, as I say, it seemed to me that he was really present, and so I continued to be greatly distressed. I was freed from this doubt by a very learned man from the order of the glorious Saint Dominic, who told me that God was indeed present, and who described how God communicates himself to us. These truths brought me very great comfort. Teresa of Avila, Life. Every day is not a sunny day, and awareness of the divine is not always of the same intensity. As Walter Hilton observes, the awareness of special grace that accompanies the invisible presence of God and makes the soul perfect in love does not always continue at its highest intensity, but comes and goes unpredictably. The Holy Spirit breathes where he wills, and you hear his voice, but you do not know whence he comes or whither he goes. Sometimes he comes secretly when you are least aware of him, but you will recognize him unmistakably before he goes, for he stirs your heart in a wonderful way and moves it strongly to contemplate his goodness. Then your heart melts with delight at the tenderness of his love like wax before the fire, and this is the sound of his voice. Then, before you realize it, he departs. He withdraws a little, but not entirely, and the soul passes from ecstasy into tranquility. The intense awareness of his presence passes away, but the effects of grace remain as long as the soul keeps itself pure, and does not willfully lapse into carelessness and worldliness, or take refuge in outward things. Walter Hilton, Ladder of Perfection. The Italian Franciscan nun Angela Foligno, 1248 to 1309, similarly describes how her habitual sense of the divine presence sometimes gives way to an experience of even greater profundity. When the soul feels the presence of God more deeply than is customary, then it knows with certainty that he is within it. It feels it, I say, with an understanding so marvelous and so profound, and with such great love and divine fire that it loses all love for itself and for the body, and it speaks and knows and understands those things of which it had never heard from any mortal whatsoever. Angela Foligno, Book of Divine Consolation. Thomas Kelly, writing more than 6 centuries later, also mentions that both the intensity and the duration of the experience can vary. He wrote, "There come times when the presence steals upon us, all unexpected, not the product of agonized effort, and we live in a new dimension of life. You who have experienced such plateaus of glory know what I mean. Out from the plane of daily living suddenly loom such plateaus. Before we know it, we are walking upon their heights, and all the old familiar landscape becomes new. One walks in the world, yet above the world as well, giddy with the height, with feather tread, with effortlessness and calm security, meeting the daily routine, yet never losing the sense of presence. Sometimes these periods are acute and brief, too dazzling to report to anyone. Sometimes they are less elevated but more prolonged, with a milder sense of glory and of lift, yet as surely of a piece with the more acute experience. Such experiences are emotionless in themselves, but suffuse all emotion with a background of peace, utter peace and security." Thomas Kelly, Testament of Devotion. Kelly goes on to speak of the swiftness with which worries can be swept aside by a sudden influx of grace that brings with it an awareness of the divine. The sense of presence. I have spoken of it as stealing on one unawares. It is recorded of John Wilhelm Rowntree that as he left a great physician's office, where he had just been told that his advancing blindness could not be stayed, he stood by some railings for a few moments to collect himself, when he suddenly felt the love of God wrap him about as though a visible presence enfolded him, and a joy filled him such as he had never known before. Kelly notes that the 3 essential aspects of the experience are love, joy, and peace, but primarily it is a matter of love. At the center of divine presence is an inflooding, all-enfolding love, which embraces all creation, not just our little, petty selves. Thomas Kelly, Testament of Devotion. For human beings, aware of our imperfections and distractions, it is sometimes difficult to let go of the accompanying disquiet and, in forgetfulness of self, to let in the sweetness, kindness, tenderness, and all-embracing love and care of the divine presence. The divine is more intent on reaching into our hearts than we may be of letting him in. If we were persuaded of the goodness of God towards his poor creatures, and of his desire to communicate himself to them, we should not imagine so many obstacles, nor despair so easily of obtaining that good which he is so infinitely desirous of imparting to us. Madame Guyon, Short Method of Prayer.